I see it is already 1 o'clock, so we're going to get started. You are tuned into ecological forestry in the context of climate change. And today we're excited to hear from Klaus Puettmann on ecological silviculture for Douglas-Fir and Western Hemlock Forest. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gwyneth, and she'll get us started. Take it away, Gwyneth.
Hello, everyone, and welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here at the National Conservation Training Center in sunny Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and today's webinar is Ecological Silviculture for Douglas-Fir Western Hemlock Forests. We have Dr. Klaus Puettmann here today from Oregon State University, and we'll be introducing him in a wee bit, but first we're going to go over a couple pre-webinar items. First and foremost, if you want closed captioning, we have a captioner today, and like we always do. And so if you're interested in that, let us know, and it is there for you. We also have an ASL interpreter as well. And yeah, we also would like to start off this week's webinar with the Conservation Training Center land acknowledgement. And so the National Conservation Training Center is located on ancestral lands of many indigenous people. These include, but are not limited to, the Massagomack, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. NCTC is dedicated to building relationships with indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn more about the lands that they resided. I would be happy to share links to those interested where you can learn about the inhabitants of the land that you live and work on. So let me know in the chat. Here at NCTC, we also welcome all students, and we also understand that by conserving biodiversity, we also need to preserve diversity of ideas and also people. And so it is my intention to create a safe and inclusive and productive webinar environment that honors and supports diverse ideas, since we are strengthened by diverse ideas and perspectives. And so if there's any struggles that you come across, please make sure to message me in the chat. You can message the hosts and panelists privately if you would like. So let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Also, a quick disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only, and the views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are that of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the material and images may be protected by copyright and have licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of every product names, companies, web links, textbooks, and other references does not imply federal endorsement. Since this webinar is being recorded live, all participants are muted, but that does not mean that we don't want you to introduce yourself. You can do so in the chat. Go ahead and put your name in and where you're from and maybe a fun fact. But yeah, we do want you to participate. We will be seeing if people want to ask questions both at the middle of the webinar and also at the end. We'll try and finish up on time. We're normally finishing up late, just to give you a heads up. And so yeah, please submit the questions in the chat for Jeff, and we'll have some answers hopefully from Klaus. Oh, and make sure when you ask questions and introduce yourself, you have everyone tagged, not just the panelists, but we like to hear questions too. Also, the best way to view the webinar is to have the side-by-side gallery. You can check that out by going to the little square on My View and then going down to side-by-side gallery. Then you can not only see the speaker, but also our ASL interpreters as well. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jeff. Take it away.
Again, welcome everyone. So I think folks know this event is sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Ecology Working Group, our science applications and migratory birds programs, and we get huge assistance from the National Conservation Training Center. But we also partner with the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science with USDA to deliver this series. And then you see some contacts up there for the series. You can reach out to Lindsay Grayson, who is part of our Forest Ecology Working Group, or you can reach out to me. And you can reach out to Gwyneth, who you see her name there, on technical issues. And then finally, if you need credits for the Wildlife Society or Society of American Foresters, you should reach out to Jim Siegel, whose email is also there. Thanks, Gwyneth. And then a little more about the series. It's a 12-part monthly webinar series that tells a story about how small and large-scale forest disturbances, fire, wind, ice storms, hurricanes, sea level rise, the whole gamut, as well as endemic forest pests and other things and other disturbances impact forest ecosystems. So the series examines ecological silviculture and climate adaptation approaches to help inform forest and wildlife management. So today you're going to hear from Klaus, but I'll also do a quick commercial for next month's webinar, which is our final webinar in the series. And in this case, we're anchored by Brian Palak, and Brian's going to be talking about the place of ecological silviculture now and in the future. And you'll see he'll be talking about landscape scale events and preventing forest management divergence. So that will be interesting. So that's on August 20th. But before that, you're going to hear from Klaus. So next slide, please, Gwen. Okay, so really excited to hear Klaus's presentation. So Dr. Klaus Puettmann is professor at Oregon State University. He has a diploma, interestingly, from University of Freiburg in Germany, where I believe Klaus grew up. And his PhD is from Oregon State University in Corvallis, and that's in silviculture and forest modeling. And Klaus has a particular interest focused on managing for species and structural diversity in forests. And as folks know, there's lots of discussion still, on how we manage structural diversity, how traditional we get, or how much we look into alternative approaches. And Klaus is an expert on them. And recently he has focused more on silviculture options to increase this adaptive capacity of forests and of foresters, in the face of climate change. So with that, really looking forward to hear from Klaus. Klaus, take it away.
All right, is it shared? On that, sorry, I can't see you. Can you give me an audio?
Yeah, we got a thumbs up. Yeah, it's all you are good to go. And Klaus, before you get started, I'm just going to say I'm going to throw a couple links into the chat for folks. The first one is where you guys can find all these recordings, and this one will also be recorded. And that link is to the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub. And so you can see all the recordings and most of the PDFs from past webinars and from Klaus's. And then Klaus provided a couple links that you guys might be interested in. One is linked to a paper on forest restoration using variable retention forestry, and then another link from a talk Klaus gave on managing for old growth forests. So I'll toss all those in the chat so you guys can get. Sorry to interrupt, Klaus. Just wanted to get that up. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the introduction and welcome everybody. So today I'll talk about the temperate rainforest there in Western Oregon and Washington. And I should mention, as I have here at the bottom of the slide, that this is really a collection of knowledge that I've gathered from interacting with lots and lots of people, especially, of course, Brenda McCon, John Tapner, and you'll see some slides from Andrew Marshall here as well, but there are lots and lots of others more. Several of those were and will be speakers in this series. So just brief of an outline here. Actually, the size of the font here kind of reflects where I spent my emphasis on that. I'll start with a little background, focus on the BLM as the major place here in Oregon where they have implemented ecological forestry, and that picture up here is a slide from BLM land. And then I'll focus a little bit more on management aspects, and I'll draw more heavily from some of our recent research here, or not so recent anymore by now. And you'll see a picture here, Google Earth, from one of our study sites that we have in Oregon on that. And Then at the end, I switch scales a little bit and briefly mention assisted migration as a link of that. So first I should introduce Oregon and Washington and its background, the historical aspects. And what you see here is really a map of the tribes in this Western Oregon, Western Washington region. You have Seattle up here, the boundary, the Columbia is here, and we're down in Oregon, the California border. And you see that this landscape was fairly densely settled by several tribes, and the indigenous people had a strong footprint on the landscape on that. And I think we've learned a little bit the last couple of decades, probably stronger than we had thought in the past, and that has several implications that I'll emphasize here along the way. So I figure I start with that right away. Just for the background, seeing, the people showing up in the chat from all over the country. So I'll really talk about this western third of the state of Oregon, and then Washington is similar in that aspect. But I focus on Oregon here, at least because I got the map, and Oregon has a unique feature. This is where the BLM comes in. Down here, we have lots of public lands, as you can see, especially federal land. State is only, I think, 3.5%, 4% on that. And private land, we have quite a bit of presence of investment companies in there and small private land. But in terms of the public land, you'll see some patterns here. This is the Western Cascades. You have the public lands here, the Forest Service. And then these checkerboard patterns in here, I'll zero in on that a little bit more as one example. That is BLM land, I think 2.8 million acres, if I'm right, one of the few places where the BLM manages forest land versus grasslands on that. And that's a historical story due to the railroad. That checkerboard pattern is a result that the land got deeded to the railroad to build the rail line. The Oregon-California Railroad, eventually went bankrupt, and then in the 20s, the land was reverted to federal land. And at that time, at least, it went to the Department of Interior, which is really the land-owning, department in the federal government. And so the BLM, as the managing agency, has this land on fairly productive sites, certainly compared to the Forest Service, not just the high elevation sites on that. And but of course, these checkerboard patterns has this unique set of challenges. And one thing to think about ecological forestry, and especially federal land, that what we see on federal land, most of or big part of the harvesting activities was starting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Really, and then of course it kind of shut down dramatically in the early 90s there when these spotted owl got listed. So when we look at the map and we see federal land, a lot of that federal land that was managed in the past is now in young, established and fairly successfully established Douglas-Fir plantations on that. So that age class distribution and the species distribution has really shifted to this bulk of this stands that the BLM and the Forest Service in places is managing. Those were plantations established in the 60s, 70s, and 80s on that. And of course, that has an imprint on the opportunities they have to implement ecological forestry. And in contrast here, just for the checkerboard pattern, I think I have a slide later from Google Earth. The industrial lands are really pushing for shorter and shorter rotation. They're talking about 30 years or even less on that, even though right now I don't think on average they're there. So that's a little bit of the background in here. And I'll switch now to the BLM, and as an example, as an agency that has embraced industrial forestry. And this is actually a cut out of or copy of the book that Brian and Tony edited here, and that just came out, that showed examples of ecological forestry, throughout the world for that matter. And Abe Wheeler, the silviculturist from the BLM, was the leader of the section for the Pacific Northwest here in this stuff. And so he kind of or actually the group, Jerry Franklin was involved and other authors. So they kind of point out that for the BLM, on that, even in the industrial, I mean, even in the ecological forestry section, you'll see that there is still a big component, that it's 65% here, that is focused on timber production. There is still in the fact of producing land. And then the rest of it, about 35%, this is what they figure is focused on the large old trees, the snags. So these are really habitat components, and I'm focused on that down the line on that. And as I think Abe writes in there, this is typical. Of course, it'll vary depending on the stand you are, but they've really kind of contrasted that with the timber-focused one, where the bulk of it, 90-some% of the side effort, side resources, go into timber production. And so that's kind of the background that the BLM is managing right now. And again, this is the table from the book is in there. And what you'll see here is, and I don't mean that negative, but I guess the usual suspects in terms of ecological forestry that you've heard about throughout this series in the various regions. There are things like variable densities, of course, species mixtures, natural regeneration, skips and gaps on that. So those aspects that you saw covered in other talks are, of course, also on the docket here in the Pacific Northwest when we deal with Western Hemlock and Douglas-Fir forest. I should mention, though, the kind of highlight for the BLM, you will see here the main activities, of course, have been in these stands, the 40, 50, 60-year-old stands that were established as plantations back then. And of course, so when you look at which aspects here of these treatment types have gotten most attention, it's really that commercial thinning, variable density thinning, where most of the effort has been done here on that, reflecting again the stand conditions that the BLM has to deal with. Now, the BLM has certain proportions, of course, of land that is still old growth or older growth, and right now they're really focusing on those plantations in their ecological forestry efforts, in the management efforts for that matter. And obviously that's where most of the restoration benefits can be obtained. I should point out that on certain lands, the Forest Service is very district by district, as far as I can tell. Some are more aggressive in this ecological forestry. Some of them are a little bit more conservative. On the more productive sides, on the Sayusla, I tend to see larger openings on that, and I think that's partially reflected with concerns about regeneration of Douglas-Fir because they have such an aggressive shrub layer that can come in that kind of setting. But either way, all of those on the federal land, it's really imprinted on this larger land base of plantations from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there's also, I should say, that managing those plantations, it's a lot easier to get a social license for harvesting and a lot less pushback going into those plantations versus going into older natural stands. So that's partially reflected there as well. And just a few pictures here that what some of the BLM lands look like on that. You'll see here, this picture kind of shows on the left a BLM unit on that, and again, reflecting that checkerboard pattern, the reason I spent a little time on that. On the right here, you see industrial ownership, and actually the front is industrial ownership as well. And actually now, if you look on the maps or if you drive around, you can see those boundaries between the different ownerships on that. So this ecological forestry, as is kind of presented here, I want to move a little bit now to the stand development models that are behind that. And one of them is that it's been taught for a while, has this conventional model that, we have these large disturbances in this temperate rainforest every few hundred years, 300 to 400, 500, 600, 700 years, depends on where you are. And then a long time between those disturbances that allowed that forest to develop into old growth as the species that are long-lived stick around in that setting. And so that's been really the the standard model. And if you look here, after this drawing, there's several of these drawings, but this drawing also actually nicely points out stuff I'll emphasize more. You start, with some residuals, you go through this stage, including the stem exclusion phase. And then later on, it gets older. We see more and more spatial complexity in this kind of setting. So that has been the model that has been promoted, and that we've based some of our we've based our management on. And here is a list that from a paper that Jerry Franklin led in 2002, and they compared, the group here compared different models, and you can see here this is the model proposed by Franklin in 2002, an older one by Oliver and Larson. But they all kind of, at least for the Pacific Northwest, go through this same phase: big disturbance, a long time without disturbance, and then we get this vertical diversification and the spatial complexity later on that. And you also see actually that all of these have some kind of emphasis on what they call, I guess Oliver and Larson call it the stem exclusion phase, canopy closure, thinning phase, competitive exclusion, aggradation phase. So this phase there where the forests are in this stem exclusion phase dominated by a dense overstory. And I'll emphasize why I point this out in a minute. And then a few years back, a group around Jerry Franklin kind of questions that stand development model. Based on that, you see at the top, this would be the traditional, conventional one. Again, disturbance, a long time without disturbance, and eventually development of this spatial little diversity and the spatial structure. And they had contrasted in what they call the precocity model. And you can almost look at this as, if you remember your biology, conventional is relay floristics. We have initials here early on that had a change condition, so the next stage could develop that change condition, so the last stage could develop. And precocity, you can almost look at it at initial conditions. That means that stand complexity here was in place right from the beginning, and maybe even didn't even change on that. But there was this long open, or what they call pre-forest phase, where you had slow regeneration, partially due to seed limitations, of course, either because it wasn't a good seed year, spatial issues that it's so far, the seed only flies so far, and maybe some years with unfavorable environmental conditions. But all of these models, regardless of the conventional versus the precocity, they also assume that there is no disturbance along the way that eventually leads to this old growth pattern on that. And so Donato and the group, Jerry was involved in that as well, kind of contrasted that conventional model in terms of, years since the stand replacing disturbance. You have this tree establishment. This is the classic one in the drawing. The precocity one, you have this long period of establishment, and then eventually it gets into the competitive stand exclusion. So that's in both models. And then eventually later on, it develops into that spatial complexity. And I'm picking on that a little bit, I have to admit. Oops. Yeah, I'm picking on that, especially on that stem exclusion phase on that. So, one thing as I've, I guess, had discussions and traveled around and seen forests in many places, I'm getting the impression we've given that stem exclusion phase way too much credit or emphasis, or whatever you want to call it, on that. It's been really kind of, in many places, is viewed as the standard of good forestry, a healthy forest, and stuff that you have this forest, the rest of the site resources go into trees, to the exclusion, of course, of other processes and other plants and animals for that matter as well. And I can't help to think about that this focus is really kind of a carryover bias from our focus on timber production. Obviously, it makes sense to have stem exclusion during timber production, that the site resources go into your value sell. But the more I kind of learn about forests in different settings, and the more I kind of, visit people, especially in Europe, I spent 2 months a year in Europe, and seeing the challenges and problems they have with their forest, the more I think that the stem exclusion phase was never as important as certainly I thought it was when I was learning about these models and my work around these models, and that it probably won't be as important and or prominent in the future as we see climate change in that as well. I've kind of been actually telling people, especially in some discussions in Europe, we really don't want to sell the story that give us some money, we change the species, and then we keep the forest the way it is, and everything is all right. We have to prepare them that the forest in the future will look different, and one of the things that will look different is the stem exclusion or full stocking, for one. So that's part of my, I guess, personal bias. I want to be transparent about it. And part of the reason why I came to this conclusion is the work that Andrew Marshall and several other people in Oregon did here in the last few years. Here you can see actually from 1550 to 2000, this is within an old growth stand. Each horizontal line is a tree, and each little dash up here is a fire in this setting. So you can already see that during this development of the old growth stand, it wasn't like the conventional model and even the precocity model assumed that there was no disturbances. Clearly, there were fires there, but they were not stand replacing fires. And here you can see again each horizontal line in a tree. You see the fire scars we have, and you can here see the birth date of the trees on that. So these fires, these disturbances that happened during the life of that old growth stand, including disturbances, establishment of Douglas-Fir, but also other species, even shade-tolerant species, are related to those disturbances, those fires in this setting. And so when you then look at that old growth stand had certain phases in there where there were fairly low-key disturbances or none, and then phases where there were disturbances, again, not stand replacing, but enough that it established cohorts on that. And so that is intrinsically different than those other stand development models on that. And actually how that happened, you can also see here, this is a stem map of that stand. On that, you see the different species, and the bigger the circle, the bigger the tree. But I want to highlight here, if you look at the birth dates and group them, you have this 711 fire reflected in cohorts. You have the 1763 fire and the 1861 fire on that. So they established in patches. So those fires burned through the stand, did not kill all the trees, but opened up patches sufficiently enough for regeneration to happen, including Douglas-Fir regeneration on that. And again, bringing it back to the beginning, these fires, when they looked at the correlation of the incidence of these fires, when the natives were still prominent on the landscape, the fires didn't seem to be correlated with the weather patterns. They didn't only burn during dry years. They burned during dry and wet years fairly frequently across the landscape. In contrast, once the natives were removed to a reservation in the 1850s, the fire pattern changed, and the fire seemed to be more prominent in the dry years only on that. So clearly highlighting that the Native Americans had a strong footprint on the landscape, and a footprint on the landscape that is reflected in those old growth structures on that. And so that certainly changes things. And the one thing, this is a quote from Andrew, he's quite outspoken about that for that development, at least for certain aspects of the old growth development, those disturbances are key. It's really not the absence of disturbances that led to the development of the old growth, but those disturbances were a big part of that in terms of developing those old growth structures. And that really changes things a little bit. I mean, you think about that, the biggest management impact we have, I think, on these stands in terms of old growth development is that we're taking those disturbances out on that. Probably more than any other impact on the landscape on that, especially the big fires, of course, but the small fires, of course, as well. And, the Native American did burn that. And of course, I want to point out, not that I want to promote fires here. I'm going camping in an area with lots of smoke on that, and of course I'll complain about it. But even there is a lot of information coming out that those fires in the past, besides the direct impact they had on the vegetation, the smoke had impact on mistletoe development, on insects, fungi, etc. So we've taken all that out by this, and again, that really changes to me the notion of how we think about management for these old growth like late successional habitat structures. And the one example I want to highlight here is we have the marbled murrelet on the coast species listed of high concern. And you can see here they build a nest in old stands on that near the coast. They go up to 30, 40 miles inland though, but it's not really a nest. They find this branch with some moss on it and plop in a terrible flyers. And they need a certain structure of the branch as well as the adjacent trees. And Andrew and his group has mapped out a bunch of nest trees and their surroundings to develop on that. And what I want to highlight here on the right, this is from one of our research sites where we looked at the canopy there with LiDAR of trees that grew in the forest itself, this even when it was thinned. And the edge trees, the crown certainly was different. You can see the edge was on the left side. The crown didn't lift. The branches were strong and thicker on the gap side on that. But even 20 years later, there is no indication that's anywhere close to developing crown structures that would facilitate marbled murrelet habitat. So really, it's the finding that the marbled murrelet habitat in the past is created because there were repeated disturbances that kept areas open in the forest. So getting back to the stand development models, you have the two ones on the left, and I want to add, not replace, but add another stand development model based on Andrew Marshall's work and some of the other, of course, work we have done around the area here. This third model, what we call non-stand replacing disturbance model. On that, you can see here we have the establishment of the trees and the understory. And we have that repeatedly over time on that. So we have these repeated disturbances and happening, repeated, establishment of cohorts, but also the spatial complexity not being non-stand replacing. It doesn't start from zero. It stands there, and every disturbance increases that spatial complexity. You hear where we are with the, I guess, in the shaded areas and the other ones as well. And then we have the overstory development there. And I also added that because it's non-stand replacing, the decadence doesn't just start at the end there. We have decadence and decay, etc., all the way through the life of that. So what I really suggest that if we want to manage for these habitats in these settings, we probably need to we are better off accepting and basing our management on a combination of all three. And depends on where you are, you can emphasize one or the other more. And of course, one other thing to point out when we have these repeated disturbances, this fits a lot better in terms of addressing indigenous knowledge and opportunities for cultural burning, promoting culturally valuable species as well. But also, I guess, highlighting, using these three models and the combination of three models are basis for our management, and I'll highlight what that means in a minute, also means we allow the forest to be more diverse and to be more prepared for disturbances. I'll get to that. But at the minimum here, I think what that means compared to the book article, and I don't want to pick on the authors, but I would personally at this stage, compared to when they wrote it, add that somewhere that even in that young forest stage, we have some disturbances that create openings on that encourage reforestation. And again, I think especially, working with the tribes, this is a great opportunity to bring in indigenous knowledge and co-manage with them in the process. So that would be the minimum changes I suggest. In In the big picture, though, we want to think about the natural adaptation mechanisms. And this is something I've kind of pulled from, actually, Conrad was the mathematician. But I want to highlight, over the years through evolution, there have all these mechanisms that have played out in nature that allowed the ecosystems to change when the environment changed on that over the millennia on that. And they play out at different organization levels, they play out simultaneously, they interact with each other. It's quite complex in this kind of setting. But one of the management goals, if you think about especially global change issues, is to make sure we strengthen those mechanisms. And I'll highlight, I guess, migration, assisted migration in the minute. And I think by using multiple stand development models to base your management on, we strengthen more of these, and we prepare the forest for what I call surprises, for things that we couldn't think of, that we hadn't planned for, that came as a result of global change drivers. So summing up that here for the first part, if we think about those old growth forests and be interested in this old growth habitat on that, again, I focus on habitat since we're sponsored by the Fish and Wildlife Service, but it's also a great indication of our quantifying stand structures and composition. If we use those as a guide, not as a blueprint, but we really need to acknowledge that they were not untouched. It's not natural development that led to those, that there was a big impact of indigenous people, plus the natural disturbances. And that in the landscape of these Western hemlock Douglas-Fir forest, we likely found a combination of some patches with conventional models, some with the precocious models where that spatial complexity was there early on, but also patches and certainly our sites seem to indicate, quite a bit of the landscape did have this non-stand replacing disturbance patterns, which then allowed, when we look at some of the old growth stands, some of the Douglas-Fir is 60 years younger than some other ones, and that would explain why after 60 years on these highly productive sites with all the other plants coming in, there was still an opportunity for Douglas-Fir to establish on that. And so what does that mean in terms of, management aspects, especially when we think about young stands? In the past, when I did my research, I justified this. We go into these plantations, these homogeneous stands, and we want to accelerate those late successional structures. I think what Andrews and other work now suggests, there is also more than acceleration going on. We need some of those management aspects to obtain those structures. And the marbled millet is one of them, certainly, that seems to be quite prominent there. And especially since we've taken those natural disturbances out of the system. Again, I think, as Andrew said, the biggest management impact right now we have on the landscape is that we take fire out as much as we can. But I also want to highlight and push that emphasis on management is, those stands that we now go in and manage, again, on federal land, these plantations from the 70s and 80s, those are way outside of the natural range of conditions. So that additional push there is really necessary on that and beneficial on that. So maybe I'll stop there and give an opportunity for some questions, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. So I can see you have folks thinking here. So there's a couple comments in here, and they have an inherent question within them. But let me take Cheryl Friesen's question, and she's saying, it's so, with current warming climate, the ability to use prescribed fire is just really challenging, and the windows are so narrow. So, she said, you go from very wet conditions to extremely dry conditions, in a very short period. And so she's saying she didn't think the Native Americans had those constraints. So how do we deal with that? So it really is difficult to add fire to the mix when we have all these constraints.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm well aware that at least in the bigger landscape, fire will never have that imprint on the landscape than it had in the past. If nothing else, because we got houses now mixed in and everything else. Yeah, this is really a challenge. On certain spots, I think I'd encourage to really work with the tribal lands. Specifically selected stuff I've worked with, they talk about spots that are easy accessible near the ridges where the roads are, where the elder can come in and collect their culturally valued species that benefit from the fire. On the other hand, some of our silvicultural treatments mimic some of the aspects of fire on that. Certainly, some of our study sites, we've looked at that and we have benefited huckleberry and other fire culturally valuable species as well. So if we can't use fire, I agree, then we have to look at what other disturbances, managed disturbances can we use to mimic and maybe replace at least some of the aspects that the fires had in the past.
All right, so that's a pretty good comment. So there's another comment here, and it's from Stephen, and he was looking at your stand modeling, and the question, he said, it appears more of a gap phase replacement model that you were, I think this was when you were looking at the various cohorts, and he said it looks like more of a gap phase replacement model, more aligned with what we learned for wet tropical forests. So would you agree with that?
Yeah, I guess that's probably a fair comparison. The question is scale, and I'll get into that in a minute on that. But yeah, at a certain scale, it's a gap replacement model. But it seems to be, again, in the history, it almost seems to be a two-phase disturbance pattern. There is this large-scale disturbances every few hundred years, and after large-scale disturbances, there's the time when we have these smaller-scale disturbances, and after a period there, then even those peter out in that point. So it's not consistently throughout the life, maybe, but certainly the first 50, 60 years after large-scale disturbances, the likelihood of like fire coming in and having that impact is higher. So it's not consistent or linear, but clearly there is some gap replacement aspects in there. Yes, good point.
No, so that's good. So look, I don't want to keep you too long here, so we're going to let you get back to things, but I will give you one to think about. There was that don't answer it now, but from Elizabeth Grayer, she was mentioning that under the the 2016 resource management plan for Western Oregon for the BLM, there's much more harvest in the older natural stands, and so what's the social license for that, and don't answer that now, we'll come back to that, but what's the justification for that? And then there's some more good questions coming in too, Klaus. So I'll let you get back to it, and we'll have some good questions at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a potential landmine.
Of course, that's why I wanted to give you a little heads up. All right.
All right. So what does that mean for management now with these stand development models? At first we have to think about scale. I'll briefly talk about landscape scale and then get at the patch scale. We're talking about this gap replacement model on that. In terms of the landscape, we've actually tried, there's been some discussion about the triad, a combination of set aside, ecologically managed and intensively managed forest on that kind of setting. And with the patch level, I'll focus on habitat components. Now here is a Google Earth of some of the Oregon landscape. I kind of highlighted that on the map. So this is a combination here of BLM land. Those would be the dark green, and anything lighter green or light brown there is private land. And I guess the more it goes towards brown, the more recent the clear cut is in this kind of setting. On the other hand, you see on the left side here, this is the part of the Sayusla National Forest. We see large blocks on that. So in some ways, the spatial variability on the landscape is already mapped on the landscape by the ownership pattern, by historical reasons. And that has some implications, of course, in terms of habitat and how we can manage the landscape. I want to highlight in a recent paper from the French group there from Duflo that talked about, in terms of landscape, you have landscape level biodiversity or gamma diversity, if you remember your biology. And then down here, they simulated different management approaches. So different, silviculture approaches. And you can in some ways think about that. Different approaches are related to different development models on that. And so the patterns you can see, actually you have 3 lines, and the lines vary in their evenness. So highly even conditions up in the upper one and highly uneven conditions in there. And so what they really highlight that if you use different management approaches on landscape, the more you use, the more diverse the biodiversity gets at the landscape level. Now, if you want to get diverse things, you do diverse things. So really no surprise there in this kind of setting. But what I want to point out in that sense with ecological forestry, be careful. One size does not fit all. Even within ecological forestry, if you do the same thing everywhere, that may not be the best at the landscape level. But I also want to point out here, they have this dashed line with a question mark. That is really an indication where when the patches of, I guess, different colors here are different successional stages. Sorry, I should have said that. But when the patches of different successional stages become too small, they don't become, they're not as valuable habitat or more for many species. So when things get chunked out too small, we actually lose species because of what they call the area heterogeneity trade-off on that. And of course, this effect kicks in a lot earlier and a lot more intense in stands that start with high unevenness on that down here. So in that sense, our checkerboard pattern may have some advantage on that, while these mix of at another scale, the checkerboard and big block type lands may get hit harder if we increase management diversity through those area heterogeneity trade-off in terms of providing opportunities for habitat. Then I want to focus on the patch level on that, and I stole this slide from Brenda McComb's presentation here last year on that without asking her permission on that. But I really want to kind of shift this notion from ecological forestry as this big thing that we do to thinking about bottom up. It's part of my complexity theory bias on that, to really think about it, as Brenda kind of pointed out already, habitat is not one homogeneous thing. It's a collection of different components. And I want us to think of ecological forestry also not as one homogeneous thing, but really think about it from the bottom up as what kind of components do we want in terms of habitat, and what kind of management practices would help us get there. And so I'm going to focus on just a few here. The links to the publication and last year's talk with the Forest Steward Guild provide more details on that. But one of the things I want to highlight in Western Oregon forest here is we have a highly dynamic, very productive forest. So you can see here, actually, in one side in the Sayulsa National Forest, it was thinned and had 44% canopy openings. 8 years later, it was back to 26. Some of our other studies here on the Willamette National Forest have the same thing. So if we come in and we think about setting the stage for a certain habitat opening, canopy openness, we got to be aware that within 10, 15, 20 years, we may be back before treatment on that, really pushing on the multiple treatment idea, which fits that non-stand replacing forest model as well. And the second thing I want to highlight just with tree growth here, I just have this kind of shows the trees that stood right at the edge of a gap. And the yellow are the trees in the forest, and you can see that those trees at the edge of the gap grew actually 40% faster in terms of diameter right after thinning on that. And that's really an indication what we found in our standard thinning, especially the low thinning. You thin, and what happens is the trees that really benefit are the smaller trees. The ones that are already big within the stand really hardly see the benefit unless you really open it up, like we did with the gap. So if you think about growing big trees, our standing thinning is not enough, and it plays out at this patch scale, what is directly adjacent to that tree. I already highlighted that. I guess I should have given that the crown is responding, but fairly slow in this kind of setting. So in some ways, if you want to create certain crown structure, especially lower down here, we've already missed the boat by age 50 if you go into plantations on that. And again, that fits that non-stand replacing development model there, where we got those marbled merlad habitat structures followed that model. Thinking about snags as a habitat component, you see here the mortality over initial diameter. And what it really points out here, our analysis, what the thinning really does, it stops the mortality of the small trees on that. It doesn't really make much difference in terms of the large trees. No surprise there. So when we do leave islands on that as a potential snag creation, that is limited by that in this case, the upper line here, that the mortality is really focused in the small trees in this kind of setting. Talking about regeneration on that, I want to highlight, I was actually surprised that even in our controlled settings, we found little seedlings just about anywhere, actually, or half of the plots. These are, I guess, 135 square feet plots that we looked at that and the probability of finding a seedling in those. And it's a function of the overstory. There, no surprise there that as the basal area of the overstory increased, the Douglas-Fir regeneration decreased. But it also is a combination of the understory vegetation that we have to think about disturbances. Again, this is one thing where if we can't use the fire, we want to think about maybe other treatments that purposely, if you want to encourage the regeneration, to push that non-stand replacing disturbance pattern, we also have to think about treating the understory in that setting as part of our restoration/thinning operations. Just focusing on the understory vegetation, an important habitat component for insects and songbirds. What you see is after our treatment, the shrub cover in the control was around 40%, fairly constant. And all the treatments there, the shrub cover was really knocked back on that. You know, by the time you drop a bunch of trees there and drag them around, that's what happened. And even after 10 years, they were not back to normal. So what we're doing now is, as we kind of talk about these treatments, we think about layout of harvesting operations and skidding operation to protect some of the shrub cover to avoid this dip in the setting. But we also found when we looked at closely on that, this dip was really prominent in stands where we had that high shrub cover to begin with, our highly productive stands here on the west side. And in stands where we had fairly low shrub cover to begin with, we didn't see the effect, but the shrub cover went up right from the beginning after the harvesting operation. So those initial conditions, what I really want to highlight, both with that regen pattern here, the initial conditions of the overstory and the understory are key. This diversity, where does it come from? I want to highlight here in some of our herbs and shrubs specifically, you see the different colors here. And it's really that early successional, that early cereal species that give us this increased diversity in our treatments. And of course, it's in many places, it's the gap story where that plays out the most in this setting. So it's one of the things like Jerry Franklin once said to me, if you want to make changes, you can't be subtle. So, and again, it fits this stand development model of non-stand replacing and limits that leads to that diversity. Thinking about habitats, I want to play it more. One of John Tapperner's students looked at the probability of flowering and fruit production of the various crops, and you can see here all these from left to the right, there is an increased intensity of treatments on that. So having those plants is not enough if you want them to be a functional part of the habitat, meaning provides opportunities for pollination, provides seed for food. We also need to have higher intensity disturbances. So when we pull it all together, this is from that 2016 paper, you'll see that the responses of the different aspects or habitat components are not necessarily in sync. There is a different speed of it, and not even the same patterns, especially if you think about snaps or herbs in this kind of pattern. So if you think about the habitat as a component of all these different structural elements on that, by one treatment, we don't optimize, we don't push and benefit all conditions in the same way, all habitat aspects in the same way. So how do we put that together? Here is an example, again, with the notion of thinking about our silvicultural treatments, including ecological forestry, as a bottom-up collection. I kind of mapped out on this part of our experimental side which kind of processes were encouraged through our treatments on that. And so our standard treatment area here, we found seedlings established, I think, throughout this, even in some of the riparian buffers here on that. But we found that seedlings really didn't grow, and we had early successional vegetation until we opened things up quite well here. So you find these yellow in these open gaps that we created of different sizes. And when I say we, I mean actually the BLM under the guidance of Brenda and John. The standard thinning operation here, the bluish, is the highlighting areas where we have basically optimal conditions for tree growth at the stand level on that. So the timber production is highlighted. The leaf islands there in green is where we see the mortality patterns, again, but mortality of smaller trees. And then in terms of encouraging those large trees and the large crowns on that, we benefited those around the gaps here, and this one patch here actually, which was thinned to 20 trees per acre. And so the combination of those is really what made up that ecological treatment. And if you think about this through, you can align these with the various stand development models that we had, a combination of stand development models that we plot on the landscape. And I guess for scale purposes, I think this whole thing is, well, with the control. So this may be 130 acres or something like that. One thing, I know I'm going to cut it short here for time, but I want to highlight, we looked at what that means for adaptive capacity. On that, we went through in a study and looked at all the vascular plants and kind of binned them into which habitat aspects in terms of food provision do they support? Are they insect pollinated? Do they produce fruits, or are the leaves highly palatable? And then we subset these species that provide these habitat components. How tolerant are they to drought? How do they respond after the fire? Do they sprout? And how tolerant are they to increased heat on that? And so when we did the numbers, we found that that treatment, as I kind of highlighted on the map, on that really increased the likelihood that the plants that are there and supporting these food aspects of habitats are more likely to be in place, and therefore are more likely to provide this ecosystem service, if you want to call it that. When it gets drier, we see more fire, and we see temperature going up in stands that have received our treatment, or the treatment like we had there before. So we did increase in that aspect in terms of adaptive capacity. And just two highlights, I want to highlight again the idea of one size does not fit all. Here's one concern that you have in some of our treatments in here. Some species really don't benefit from that. The flying squirrel population in those three right columns here in 2007 on the left and 2008 really indicate that the population has gone down while it stayed a lot higher in the control. And also Matt Powers, my colleague and his student, have looked at trade-offs with different retention harvests, and you can see certainly ES is early birds. Then they have structure. They used an old growth structure index in this kind of setting, and they use some drought response that when you do some kind of treatments, there are some trade-offs to consider in this setting. So given the time, I'll stop right there and go to the last one here. I think if I want to summarize, I want to think about a diversity of habitat components, and that may lead to a diversity of management approach. You really want to think bottom up about the different habitat components and, develop your ecological forestry prescription, thinking from the bottom up, what components do you have to have? And you have to think about different scales to come into play. On that, the notion of flexibility, adaptability, like one example when you leave certain trees behind as legacies, we leave them for ecological reasons, but we can also reason for flexibility / economic reasons on that as well. Initial conditions, there's a lot of variability that needs to be played out. There's a lot of to be gained, just like getting a diversity of stand development models, different ways of knowing. And then, of course, the notion of not focusing on one stand condition, but allowing the variability in responses, it will be there and we might as well plan for it. And the last thing, as we do this, I know, reflecting Cheryl's comments, we need the logistics in mind. It needs to pay for itself. And if you look closely at some of the experimental treatments, the gaps are aligned in a way that facilitated cable logging, and that's no coincidence. I'll stop right there and open it up for comments and questions.
Oh my, thanks so much, Klaus. You gave us a ton to think about there. So that's, and by the way, importantly, in the chat, Brenda did grant permission for you to use that slide. Just so I'm sure you're very relieved by that. So there's some good questions in here. We're not going to get to all of them. It is 2:00, but we will stay for a few minutes and try to get to a couple of them. So I'm going to start with a really general question, what seems like a general question from Jean that should be easy, but maybe not so easy. Is it best to leave dead trees in the forest instead of removing them? Sounds simple, Klaus, but maybe not.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch. Instead of what? I didn't catch that.
Instead of, so is it best to remove already dead trees? Maybe they died from a major fire event. Maybe they died from an insect event. But is it best to leave those dead trees in the forest, or should you remove them?
Well, the question, the answer my students hopefully give in my class when I ask them that, it depends on that. There are various things to consider. Of course, in some places, there is a health and safety issue, people involved. If you're near roads, near trails on that would certainly bias towards removing them. I would look at the stand and the landscape and seeing how prominent are snags and downed wood in the near surroundings on that. If it's lacking, then certainly you want to keep it around in this setting. If it's not, then maybe some opportunities to remove that and get some commercial benefits out of that. I would also look at, of course, like especially coming back from Europe, they're trying very hard to harvest any tree that is attacked by the bark beetles. So they're trying to manage the bark beetle population in that way. It's not working well on the landscape, but that may be another consideration that whether you kind of, facilitate or discourage certain damage agents by removing it as well.
Right. Yeah. So that was a deceptively complex question and what seemed like a simple one. So this one has to do about fire and old growth, understory fire and old growth stands from Karen. Has exclusion of understory fires from old growth forests made them more vulnerable to uncharacteristic tree death for understory burns now? So let me say it again. Did you get it, or do you?
Yeah. Boy, that's a tough one. I feel like I'm in my prelim exam here.
We have more of the same.
I think, for the hour stands here, what I see is that lack of that disturbance homogenize those stands, and the stands are kind of locked in a little bit. If there is the individual tree mortality now, the only thing, especially in these forests, the first species that comes in is another shade-tolerant species, likely hemlock. It depends on where you are on that. So it locks it into these conditions that in many ways makes it more vulnerable to other disturbances on that. So, it limits the species that can regenerate and therefore make up the future stand. And that works as well as long as the disturbance patterns don't change. But if an insect comes, or we get the adelgid here or something that attacks our forest, we are more vulnerable to that. So for some disturbances, yes, I think it makes it more vulnerable. for other aspects in terms of other disturbances, it may not have the same impact.
Yeah, that's okay. That's pretty good. And so staying on the fire, a lot of the questions have trended along the fire use, and this is not dissimilar to what Cheryl said, but it just says that prescribed fire, this is from Jeremiah, and he says prescribed fire will never emulate historic fire patterns on the landscape due to all the complexities we talked about. And so what are the implications of that?
Well, I mean, the implications of that is, I think that we have to reconsider, what our blueprint or range of desirable or acceptable conditions is in the landscape, and that the past certainly can be a guide, but certainly not a blueprint. We have to think about that more. We also want to think about, our treatments, that alternative treatments to fire, exactly which aspect of the fire impact we can replace or mimic on that. Certainly we can, remove fuel on that with harvesting. We have a long history of doing that, but other aspects of the fire will be harder. We have to, or we think about that maybe some of those thinning treatments, we want to push more that they go hand in hand with some ground vegetation disturbance, to think about, that fire removed or killed some insects in the ground can be mimic some of that. So we have to kind of, I think, look at the various aspects that come into play. Or alternative, we just have to accept that the future forest will be different, and it will not, in many places where we can have the fires, it will not look close to what it was in the past, which means that we will not have the same species composition in terms of plants, but also animals and insects, etc., than we have in the past. We have just accept that in the future, our forests will be more vulnerable, maybe in those settings, to certain disturbances, that we can't get back to that stage.
Well, there are a couple good questions in here, so I'm going to just take one last one, and there's a good one from Charles, but it's okay. I'm going to take this because it is related to adaptive capacity. So Charles says, on the adaptive capacity, have you seen generational differences? For instance, are older trees that grew in cooler, wetter conditions less resilient to hotter, drier conditions than young trees for which that is now normal?
Yeah, but about generational differences, I thought you asked about foresters. I've seen differences there, as for one. Who might I speak? Yes, there seems to be, and there is no clear story, and it's very hard to prove, but the scientific studies seem to highlight that there is some benefit of preconditioning forests, so that, the second drought and the third drought, trees will react different than the first drought, that there are some adjustments in the root to shoot ratio and stuff like that come about with that. There seems to be also some indication of epigenetics. That means that the memory is not carried in the genes only, not locked in. And there are some people that kind of trying about, taking seed and germinating it in a nursery that's in a way warmer, drier condition, then and then bringing it back to the plantation, at hand, in that early establishment. And there's also some, I mean, it's really stretching it. I'm not sure what to think of it, where if the parents were in drier conditions, so you take a tree, you grow it in warmer, drier conditions, then you take the seed from that tree and bring it back to its original source, that there is a carryover effect from that as well, which would be epigenetic. Again, I'm not really sure how far and prominent that is. It may be able, we can show it with our statistics, significant in certain settings. Whether that is enough to make operational differences, I'm not really sure. So there is a lot more going on than our standard genetic evolutionary story. Certainly, that seems to be very clear. But I'm not sure we have a full understanding of that I would feel comfortable putting a heavy management emphasis on that.
Okay. So
it's something to watch anyway.
All right. So again, I think we need to wind down here, but this is a good question, but it seems like it's a simple question again, Klaus. And then I will let you comment if you want to on in the new BLM plan, and whether, why we might want to move into some of those stands or not, that have more natural stands. So here's Dee Dee's question. Are there any good guidelines for residual relative density or basal area targets per species and size class for accelerating old growth systems? So we all want that cookbook. So
yeah, I mean, we can look at the studies and see, what the treatments that were there and the impact it was. I would really encourage people not to think about, general density guidelines. I'd encourage people really, if you want to accelerate that, to think about spatial variability on that. The impact in terms of thinning, you really have to reduce the density to have an impact, especially on the larger trees. I would think we'd be a lot more effective if we throw in gaps and leave islands in that and focus on the spatial variability in this setting. But I also want to point out, since I have that opportunity, we should, I think, in many places, maybe not in the subboreal boreal forest, but in many places it seems to be clear that what is fully stocking and what our guidelines say is fully stocking in the past will not fit the future on that, especially if you think about some extreme events on that we will have in many places hotter temperatures and maybe more frequent, but maybe if not more frequent, longer and more intense droughts. And so you have this bottleneck that is driven. So if you want to grow your stand up, the density and the carrying capacity of that site, has to go through that bottleneck. So I would encourage everybody, if they see density guidelines, at least that's what I told my brother with his land, you push it to the lower end by any means. But for old growth development, I think focusing on that spatial variability is more important or more effective, I should say.
Yeah, structurally too. All right, that's great, Klaus. So, and then any comments on the BLM related to opening up? Yeah.
To me, I guess, you saw my discussion about the impact of past disturbances, including indigenous management, on driving the development of the stands. And so right now, in the last 50, 100 years or 100 plus years, we have taken that out. So in terms of maintaining health and vigor, I think there are some opportunities in many places to benefit the forest through active management, even older forests on that. We put in a study on the Umpqua where we're looking at, old pines and whether they still benefit from growth. And it certainly seems to the indication we have with Douglas-Fir and pine seems to be even at older ages, they notice the competition in not just for light, but also for water in the dry spots, and they respond to removal of the competition. So just because they are naturally generated and they're older doesn't mean they're immune to those changes that the environment provides now for them. And so cautiously applied, I would think that even those stands would benefit from active management to partially, replace or deal with the changes that we implement by not having managed them for a long time. Did I script that successfully?
Yeah, I think so. I do think you did that pretty well. Yeah, it's tough. Okay, so that's it, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. Sorry to keep you late, but it was great. Lots of appreciation in the chats, Klaus. So way to go. Yeah, you navigated that very well. So thank you. And you gave us lots to think about, Klaus. So thanks for taking the time. And I urge folks to look at the paper and the talk that Klaus provided in the links. And also I put a link in there for Jim Siegel if you need credits for SAF or Wildlife Society. Anything I missed, Gwyneth or Klaus?
No, I think you did well, but for everyone who's still on, please make sure to come back in August on the 20th for our final webinar. And yeah, hopefully we can get this back up and running for next year with the new gauntlet of presenters. Thanks, Klaus, for presenting.
Yeah, that was a great presentation. So and we have your PDF, which will be posted to the Northern Forest Climate Hub. So we've got you.